The winter of 1940 descended upon the small town of Harlow Falls like a burial shroud, thick, suffocating, and impossibly cold. Snow fell in relentless waves, blanketing the narrow streets and wooden storefronts in a silence so complete it felt unnatural. The kind of silence that makes people whisper instead of speak, that makes footsteps sound like confessions echoing through empty corridors. Harlow Falls sat nestled in the Appalachian foothills of West Virginia, a coal town that had seen better days. The mine that once sustained 3,000 families now employed barely 800 men, their faces perpetually blackened with dust, their lungs rattling with every breath. The Depression had carved deep wounds into the community. Shuttered businesses lined Main Street like tombstones, their windows dark and vacant. People didn't smile much anymore. They moved through their days with heads down, focused solely on survival, on making it through one more winter, one more month, one more week. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. On the eastern edge of town, where Willow Creek Road curved into darkness beneath a canopy of skeletal oak trees, stood a two-story Victorian house that seemed to lean slightly to the left, as if weighed down by secrets. The paint had long since faded from white to a sickly gray, and the wraparound porch sagged in places where the wood had begun to rot. A rusted iron fence surrounded the property, its gate perpetually ajar, creaking in the wind like a warning. This was the home of Evelyn Margaret Hartley. The locals called her the widow, though her husband had only been gone since November. 3 months. 90 days of absence that had transformed a relatively unremarkable woman into the subject of endless speculation and sideways glances at the general store. Evelyn was 42 years old, though she could have passed for younger in the right light. She had the kind of face that photographs well: high cheekbones, a sharp jawline, eyes the color of winter storms. Her dark hair, always pinned in an immaculate roll at the nape of her neck, showed only the faintest traces of silver at her temples. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, moved with practiced grace, and spoke in a voice that was perpetually measured, controlled, as if every word had been carefully weighed before leaving her lips. But it was her hands that people noticed most. Long, elegant fingers, nails always clean, always trimmed short. Hands that seemed too delicate for the rough work of maintaining a household alone, yet somehow managed it all the same. Hands that never trembled, even when discussing her missing husband. And that was the problem, wasn't it? She never trembled. Robert James Hartley had been a large man, barrel-chested and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that filled a room even when he wasn't speaking. At 51 years old, he'd owned the only automobile repair shop in Harlow Falls, a profitable business that kept food on tables and coal in furnaces. He drank bourbon every evening, smoked Lucky Strikes, and had a laugh that could be heard from 3 houses away. He was also known for his temper. The neighbors on Willow Creek Road had grown accustomed to raised voices emanating from the Hartley house on Friday nights, when Robert came home from his weekly poker game at the Elks Lodge. Shouting matches that rattled windows and sent the neighborhood dogs into fits of anxious barking. Once, Mrs. Pemberton from across the street swore she heard glass breaking, followed by a woman's cry that was cut short, as if smothered mid-breath. But Evelyn always appeared the next morning with her usual composure intact, dressed impeccably, offering polite smiles to anyone she passed on her way to the market. People talked, of course. They always did in small towns. But in 1940, in a place like Harlow Falls, what happened between a man and his wife was considered private business, sacred even, the kind of thing decent people didn't interfere with, no matter what they heard through the walls. Robert Hartley disappeared on November 17, 1939. According to Evelyn's statement to Sheriff Dalton Murphy, her husband had left the house around 8 o'clock in the evening, claiming he needed to drive to Charleston to pick up a specialty part for a customer's Chevrolet. The trip would take 4 hours round trip, maybe 5 in the snow that had begun falling that afternoon. She'd gone to bed around 10, she said, and when she woke at dawn, Robert hadn't returned. His truck was found 3 days later, abandoned on a logging road 15 miles north of town. The keys were still in the ignition. His wallet sat on the dashboard containing $43 in cash. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric or scattered belongings. Just an empty truck sitting in the snow, slowly being buried by the storm that had raged for 72 hours straight. The part he'd supposedly gone to Charleston for? No record of any order existed at any supplier within 200 miles. Sheriff Murphy, a man with 30 years of law enforcement experience and a face like weathered leather, conducted what he called a thorough investigation. He questioned Evelyn 3 separate times. He interviewed Robert's employees at the repair shop, his poker buddies, the bartender at Finnegan's Tavern where Robert was known to have a few drinks most afternoons. Everyone agreed. Robert was a creature of habit. Predictable. Not the type to just walk away from a thriving business and a house he'd inherited from his father. And yet, that's exactly what the official conclusion suggested. Robert Hartley, experiencing some unknown personal crisis, or perhaps involved in unnamed troubles, had simply vanished of his own accord. The case was filed as a missing person, and life in Harlow Falls continued its slow, grinding pace. But the whispers didn't stop. They never do in places like this. People began to notice things about Evelyn that they claimed they'd always noticed, but somehow never mentioned before. The way she never seemed particularly distressed by her husband's disappearance. How she declined offers of help from the church ladies, preferring to manage everything herself. The fact that she'd started wearing gloves constantly, even indoors, even in the sweltering heat that occasionally broke through the winter cold when she stoked the furnace too high. And then there was the smell. It started in late December, about 6 weeks after Robert's disappearance. A chemical odor that seemed to emanate from the Hartley property, particularly from the cellar windows that faced the backyard. Sharp, acrid, burning. Like industrial cleaner mixed with something organic and rotting. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned it to her husband first, then to Mrs. Chen at the market. Within a week, half the town claimed they'd noticed it too, though most admitted they'd only caught whiffs when the wind blew just right, carrying that strange scent down Willow Creek Road and into the surrounding neighborhoods. When Sheriff Murphy paid Evelyn another visit in early January, she explained calmly that she'd been cleaning. Deep cleaning, she called it. Getting rid of the accumulated dirt and grime of years, disposing of Robert's belongings, preparing to possibly sell the house and move somewhere warmer, somewhere with less painful memories. She offered to show the sheriff around. He declined. There was something in her eyes when she made that offer. A challenge, perhaps. Or maybe just the steely confidence of someone who knew they wouldn't be caught. Whatever it was, it made Murphy uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He was a man who trusted his instincts, and his instincts told him that Evelyn Hartley was hiding something significant. But instincts weren't evidence. And without evidence, without a body, without any concrete proof of wrongdoing, his hands were tied. The winter deepened. February arrived with bone-cracking cold and ice storms that transformed Harlow Falls into a frozen tableau, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Evelyn continued her solitary existence in the house on Willow Creek Road, maintaining the property, tending to her affairs, speaking to no one unless absolutely necessary. She'd always been somewhat reserved, even before Robert's disappearance. But now she'd become something else entirely, a ghost in her own life. A woman who moved through the world like she was made of different material than everyone else, something harder, colder, impenetrable. The repair shop sat closed and dark, its windows covered with newspaper. Robert's employees had found work elsewhere or left town entirely. The building itself seemed to be waiting, holding its breath, anticipating some resolution that never came. And still, the whispers persisted, grew louder, more specific. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, a peculiar incident occurred that would later be remembered as the first real crack in Evelyn's carefully constructed facade. The Harlow Falls Volunteer Fire Department responded to a call about smoke coming from the Hartley property. When Chief Arnold Weiss and his crew arrived, they found Evelyn in the backyard, burning papers in a metal drum. Nothing illegal about that. Lots of people burned their trash in those days. But the quantity was unusual. Stacks and stacks of documents, photographs, what looked like ledgers and business records. Spring cleaning, Evelyn told Chief Weiss, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Getting rid of clutter. Fresh start. It was 14 degrees outside. The ground was frozen solid. Spring was 2 months away. But again, burning your own papers on your own property wasn't a crime. Chief Weiss made sure the fire was contained and left, though he mentioned the incident to Sheriff Murphy over coffee the next morning at Rosie's diner. "There's something wrong in that house," Weiss said, stirring 3 sugars into his mug. "I've been doing this job for 23 years, Murphy. I know what normal looks like. That woman ain't normal." Murphy stared into his own coffee, watching the steam rise and dissipate. Not normal ain't illegal. Maybe not. But it ought to be investigated. The sheriff sighed, a sound heavy with frustration and something that might have been fear. With what justification? She's a widow whose husband ran off. She's cleaning house. She's burning trash. None of that adds up to probable cause. Chief Weiss leaned back in his booth, the red vinyl creaking beneath his weight. "You don't believe that. You don't believe Robert ran off. Doesn't matter what I believe. It should." The conversation ended there, but both men felt it. That tightening in the chest that comes when you know something terrible has happened, but can't prove it, can't stop it, can't even name it properly. 3 days later, on February 17th, exactly 3 months after Robert Hartley's disappearance, a traveling salesman named Eugene Bartlett pulled into Harlow Falls driving a Nash Ambassador sedan. He was passing through, heading from Pittsburgh to Louisville, and his car had developed a concerning rattle in the engine. Seeing the closed repair shop, he asked at the general store where he might find someone to take a look at his vehicle. The shopkeeper, an elderly man named Horace with one milky eye and a talent for gossip, told him the whole story. Robert Hartley's disappearance, Evelyn's strange behavior, the rumors that had calcified into something approaching collective certainty. "If you ask me," Horace said, leaning close enough that Eugene could smell tobacco and peppermint on his breath, "that woman killed her husband, and I'll bet you a silver dollar his body is somewhere in that house, or was anyway." Eugene, who was 34 and fancied himself worldly despite having rarely left Pennsylvania, laughed at this. "Come on, old-timer. This isn't some pulp detective story. Women don't just murder their husbands and get away with it." Horace's good eye narrowed. "Don't they?" That night, Eugene found lodging at the Harlow Falls Hotel, a grand name for what was essentially a boarding house with 6 rooms and shared bathrooms. He ate dinner in the downstairs restaurant, where the other patrons spoke in hushed tones about Evelyn Hartley, about the strange comings and goings at the house on Willow Creek Road, about the smell that occasionally drifted through town like a toxic fog. Eugene went to bed thinking about the story, finding it darkly entertaining in the way that other people's tragedies often are when you're just passing through, when none of it can touch you. He woke at 2:47 a.m. to the sound of an engine. His room faced the street, and through the thin curtains he could see headlights cutting through the darkness. A truck, moving slowly, deliberately, as if the driver didn't want to wake anyone. Eugene rose from bed, drawn to the window by curiosity and insomnia. The truck passed under a street lamp, and for just a moment, he saw the driver clearly. Evelyn Hartley, alone. Behind the wheel of what he somehow knew was her husband's vehicle, the one that had been found abandoned on that logging road. Driving through the silent town in the dead hours before dawn, her face expressionless, her gloved hands gripping the steering wheel. In the truck bed, covered partially by a tarp, Eugene could see the unmistakable shape of large containers, drums or barrels of some kind. 3 of them, maybe 4, secured with rope. The truck turned onto Willow Creek Road and disappeared into the darkness beneath the oak trees. Eugene stood at that window for 10 minutes, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath fogging the cold glass. He told himself he'd imagined it, that he was tired, that the stories had gotten into his head and manufactured phantoms out of shadows. But he knew what he'd seen. And when morning came, when he settled his bill and got back on the road to Louisville with his car's rattle mysteriously forgotten, Eugene Bartlett carried with him a secret that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A secret he would never report, never speak of, never acknowledge except in the dark hours of his own sleepless nights. Because some things, once seen, can never be unseen. And some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Sheriff Dalton Murphy had been a lawman long enough to recognize when a case was eating at him. It manifested physically, a tightness in his jaw, a persistent ache behind his left eye, dreams that woke him at 3 a.m, drenched in sweat despite the February cold seeping through the walls of his modest home on Birch Street. The Hartley case had burrowed under his skin like a tick, feeding on his frustration, growing fat on his inability to do anything substantial about it. It was now late February 1940, and Robert Hartley had been missing for over 3 months. In Murphy's experience, when someone vanished without a trace for that long, they were either living under a new name in some distant city, or they were dead. And Robert Hartley didn't strike him as the type to reinvent himself somewhere else. The man had roots here, deep ones, tangled and strong, binding him to Harlow Falls in ways that couldn't be easily severed, which left only one alternative. Murphy sat in his office on the second floor of the town hall, a cramped room that smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco, staring at the files spread across his desk. 3 manila folders now, stuffed with witness statements, photographs of Robert's abandoned truck, handwritten notes chronicling every conversation, every lead, every dead end. He'd interviewed 27 people. Not a single one could provide concrete evidence of foul play. But absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence, as his old training sergeant used to say. The door opened without a knock. It was that kind of office, and Deputy Frank Colson stepped inside, removing his hat to reveal hair pressed flat with pomade. Frank was 26, lean and eager, with the kind of earnest face that made people trust him immediately. "Sheriff, got something you might want to hear," Frank said, closing the door behind him. "Just came from talking to Margaret Yates." Murphy leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest. "The librarian?" "Yes, sir. She came by the station this morning, said she'd been wrestling with whether to say anything, but her conscience finally got the better of her." "About what?" Frank pulled a small notepad from his coat pocket, flipping to a dog-eared page. "About Evelyn Hartley. Apparently, Mrs. Yates has been keeping track of what books Evelyn's been checking out from the library. Started doing it after Robert disappeared, just out of curiosity, she says." Murphy felt that familiar tightening in his chest. "And? In the past 3 months, Evelyn Hartley has checked out 7 books on chemistry, 4 on anatomy, 3 on industrial cleaning processes, and 2 on—" Frank paused, glancing up from his notes with an expression somewhere between disbelief and vindication. "Animal rendering and bone dissolution." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant sound of someone shoveling snow off the sidewalk below. Murphy stood slowly, his chair scraping against the worn wooden floor. "Bone dissolution." "Yes, sir. Mrs. Yates says the books were from the reference section, mostly academic texts that the library acquired years ago for some reason she can't remember. She didn't think much of it at first. Figured maybe Evelyn was just trying to occupy her mind with reading, dealing with grief and all. But when the subject matter started following a pattern—" Frank trailed off, letting the implications hang in the air. "Did she confront Evelyn about it?" "No, sir. Said she wouldn't have known what to say. But she kept a list." Frank tore the page from his notepad and laid it on Murphy's desk. Dates and titles, all documented. Murphy picked up the paper, scanning the entries. His trained eye immediately recognized what Frank had seen. This wasn't random reading. This was research. Methodical, Purposeful research conducted by someone who needed specific information for a specific task. The last book she checked out, Murphy said, reading from the list, was 2 weeks ago. Industrial Applications of Caustic Solutions. Jesus Christ. You thinking what I'm thinking, Sheriff? Murphy was thinking several things, none of them good. He was thinking about the chemical smell people had reported coming from the Hartley house, about Evelyn's constant glove-wearing, about Eugene Bartlett, the traveling salesman who'd passed through 3 weeks earlier and mentioned to the hotel clerk that he'd seen something strange, though he'd left town before Murphy could question him properly. He was thinking about the cellar of that Victorian house on Willow Creek Road and what might be hidden in its darkness. "Get your coat," Murphy said. "We're paying Mrs. Hartley a visit." "On what grounds?" "Welfare check. We're concerned citizens making sure a grieving widow is managing all right in this harsh winter." Frank's expression showed he understood the subtext. "And if she refuses us entry? Then we'll know for certain she's hiding something." The drive to Willow Creek Road took less than 10 minutes, but to Murphy it felt like crossing into foreign territory. The houses here sat farther apart than in town, separated by overgrown lots and stands of trees that blocked out what little sunlight managed to penetrate the perpetual cloud cover. It was 1:30 in the afternoon, but the world existed in a state of permanent twilight, gray and cold and unwelcoming. The Hartley house looked worse than Murphy remembered from his last visit in January. The shutters on the second floor hung crooked, and several roof shingles had blown off in a recent storm, leaving dark gaps like missing teeth. The porch steps were coated with ice that no one had bothered to salt. But the most striking thing was the absolute stillness of the place. No smoke from the chimney despite the cold. No tracks in the snow leading to or from the front door. No sign that anyone actually lived here, though Murphy knew Evelyn was home. Her silhouette had been visible in the upstairs window as they'd pulled up, watching their approach. They sat in the patrol car for a moment, engine idling, both men staring at the house as if it might reveal its secrets through sheer force of observation. "She's watching us," Frank said quietly. "I know. Makes you wonder what she's thinking right now." Murphy didn't respond. He cut the engine, pocketed the keys, and stepped out into the biting cold. His boots crunched through snow that had been there so long it had compressed into something closer to ice, a frozen crust that crackled with each step. Frank followed him up the walkway to the porch. Murphy raised his fist to knock, but before he could make contact, the door swung open. Evelyn Hartley stood framed in the doorway, backlit by the dim interior of her home. She wore a simple black dress with long sleeves and a high collar, and those ever-present gloves, leather today, black as her dress. Her hair was pinned with its usual precision, not a strand out of place. But it was her face that made Murphy's breath catch. She looked tired in a way that cosmetics couldn't quite hide. Dark circles under her eyes, a gauntness to her cheeks that hadn't been there before. She'd lost weight, considerable weight. "Sheriff Murphy," she said, her voice carrying that same measured quality he remembered. "Deputy Colson, this is unexpected. Mrs. Hartley, hope we're not intruding. Just wanted to check in, see how you're managing with the cold weather and all." Something flickered across her face, amusement, maybe, or contempt. It was gone too quickly to identify with certainty. "How thoughtful. I'm managing perfectly well, as you can see." But Murphy couldn't see, and that was precisely the problem. Evelyn stood blocking the doorway, making no move to invite them inside, her body language clearly communicating that this conversation would be conducted on the threshold. "Mind if we come in for a moment? It's colder than a witch's—" He caught himself. "It's very cold out here. I'm afraid the house is in a terrible state. I've been doing extensive renovations to the cellar, and there's dust and debris everywhere. I wouldn't want to subject you to such unpleasant conditions." Renovations. In the middle of winter, in a house where the widow lived alone with no visible means of performing such work. "We wouldn't mind the mess," Frank said, speaking for the first time. His voice was friendly, disarming. Just want to make sure everything's all right with you, ma'am. Lots of folks in town are worried. Are they? Evelyn's tone suggested she found this dubious. How kind of them to care after months of whispered accusations and pointed stares. But please, do tell them I'm quite all right. Better than all right, actually. I've found the solitude to be remarkably liberating. Murphy shifted his weight, trying to look past her into the house. He could see a narrow hallway, stairs leading to the second floor, a doorway that probably led to the kitchen. Everything appeared normal, clean even, which contradicted her claim about dust and debris. Mrs. Hartley, I'm going to be direct with you. We've received information that concerns us. Information about your recent activities, your reading habits, certain odors reported by neighbors. My reading habits? She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Since when is it a crime to educate oneself, Sheriff? Or is intellectual curiosity now grounds for suspicion in this backwards little town? When a woman's husband disappears and she starts reading books about dissolving bones, it raises questions. The words hung between them like a physical thing, cold and sharp. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a calculation, a recalibration of her approach. I see, she said finally. Margaret Yates has been spying on me. How very Christian of her. She was doing her civic duty. Was she? Or was she feeding the gossip mill that seems to sustain this community better than bread and water? Frank took a half step forward. Ma'am, we're not here to argue. We just want to... You want to search my home. Evelyn's interruption was swift and certain. That's why you're really here, isn't it? You want to poke through my belongings, my private spaces, searching for evidence of some imagined crime? Not without your permission, Murphy said, unless you'd prefer we come back with a warrant. On what grounds? What crime am I suspected of committing specifically? Be precise, Sheriff, because last time we spoke, you told me Robert had likely left of his own accord. Has your official position changed? Murphy felt the trap closing around him. She was right. He had no grounds for a warrant. No body, no proof of crime, no physical evidence beyond circumstantial observations that any lawyer worth his salt would tear apart in court. Mrs. Hartley, he said, trying a different approach, I think you know what happened to your husband. And I think whatever you know is weighing on you. I can see it in your face. You're not sleeping. You're not eating. This secret, whatever it is, it's consuming you. For just a moment, a fraction of a second, something cracked in Evelyn's carefully maintained facade. Her eyes glistened, her jaw tightened, and Murphy thought he saw the ghost of genuine emotion flicker across her features. Then it was gone, locked away again behind that impenetrable wall. My husband, she said quietly, was not a good man, Sheriff. I suspect you knew that. I suspect everyone knew that, but chose to look the other way because that's what people do in places like this. They tolerate monsters as long as those monsters are male and maintain the appearance of respectability. Murphy said nothing. What could he say? He'd heard the Friday night arguments, same as everyone else. He'd seen Evelyn wearing long sleeves in summer, high collars when other women wore lighter clothes. He'd noticed and done nothing because that's what sheriffs did in 1940. They minded their business and let families handle their own affairs. If Robert is dead, Evelyn continued, her voice steady now, stronger, then the world is better for it. And if I had anything to do with that hypothetical death, then I did what your laws and your courts and your male solidarity would never have allowed me to do. I protected myself. That's not how justice works. Justice? The word came out like a curse. You want to lecture me about justice? Where was justice when my husband broke 3 of my ribs in 1937? Where was justice when he held my hand over a lit stove burner because dinner was cold? Where was your justice then, Sheriff Murphy? The questions hit like physical blows. Murphy had no answers, no defenses, no righteous authority to fall back on. He stood there on that frozen porch, facing a woman who might be a murderer or might be a survivor, and couldn't tell which truth frightened him more. "I'm asking you again," Evelyn said, her hand still on the door. "Do you have a warrant?" "No, ma'am." "Then we have nothing further to discuss. Good day, gentlemen." The door closed with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than any slam. Murphy and Frank stood in silence for several seconds before turning and walking back to the patrol car. Neither spoke until they were inside, the heater struggling to combat the cold that had seeped into their bones. "What now?" Frank asked. Murphy stared at the house, at the windows that reflected nothing but gray sky, at the chimney that still produced no smoke. "Now we wait, and we watch, because she's going to make a mistake eventually. They always do." But even as he said it, Murphy wondered if he believed it. Evelyn Hartley didn't strike him as the type who made mistakes. That night, unable to sleep, Murphy drove back to Willow Creek Road. He parked 3 houses down, killed his lights, and watched. He didn't know what he expected to see. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. At 3:15 a.m., a light flickered to life in the cellar of the Hartley house. Just for a moment, visible through a small window at ground level that faced the backyard. Then darkness again, so complete it might have been imagined. But Murphy knew he hadn't imagined it. Just as he knew what was happening in that cellar, behind that door, in the darkness where secrets are kept and evidence is destroyed. He knew, and knowing without proving was its own special kind of torture. March arrived in Harlow Falls like a broken promise. The snow that had blanketed the town for 4 months began to melt, revealing the rot beneath. Dead grass, rusted metal, the accumulated debris of a winter that had felt eternal. The streets turned to rivers of mud and slush, and the air carried that peculiar smell of earth awakening too soon, unprepared for the light. It had been 4 months since Robert Hartley disappeared. 123 days of silence, speculation, and mounting pressure that Sheriff Dalton Murphy felt pressing down on him like a physical weight. The case had become his obsession. His wife barely recognized him anymore. He came home late, left early, spent his nights sitting in the dark of their bedroom, staring at nothing, thinking about that cellar door and what lay beyond it. He'd lost 12 pounds. His hands shook when he held his coffee cup, and still, he had nothing concrete. Nothing that would hold up in court, nothing that would compel a judge to issue a warrant. Until March 7th, 1940. The break came from an unexpected source. Dr. Theodore Marsh, the only physician in Harlow Falls, a man who'd delivered half the town's children and buried a quarter of its elderly. He was 71 years old, with hands that trembled from early-stage Parkinson's, but a mind that remained sharp as surgical steel. He appeared at Murphy's office just after dawn, his face drawn and troubled, carrying a leather medical bag that looked as old as he was. "Sheriff, we need to talk about Evelyn Hartley," he said, closing the door behind him without invitation. "And you're not going to like what I have to say." Murphy gestured to the chair across from his desk, his heart already accelerating. "I'm listening." Dr. Marsh sat slowly, like a man bearing great weight. He placed his medical bag on his lap and stared at it for a long moment before speaking. "I've been Evelyn's physician for 20 years. Treated her for various ailments, injuries, many of which I documented but never reported because, well, that's not what we did back then. A woman's marital troubles were considered private matters." He paused, his jaw working as if chewing bitter medicine. "I regret that now, deeply." "What kind of injuries are we talking about?" "Broken bones, burns, contusions consistent with repeated physical trauma. 3 years ago, she came to me with a fractured jaw. Said she'd fallen down the cellar stairs. I knew she was lying. I knew Robert was doing it. And I said nothing beyond patching her up and sending her home." Murphy felt the familiar anger rising in his chest. Not at the doctor, but at the system, at the culture, at himself for being part of it. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because yesterday, Evelyn came to my office for the first time since Robert disappeared. and I saw something that frightened me more than anything I've witnessed in 50 years of medical practice. Dr. Marsh opened his bag and withdrew a small notebook, his handwriting cramped and precise on the yellowed pages. Her hands, Sheriff. I need you to understand. Her hands are severely damaged. She wears gloves constantly. Yes, and now I know why. When I examined her, when she finally removed those gloves at my insistence, I found chemical burns covering both hands. Second and third degree burns on her palms, her fingers, burns that are weeks old and have been inadequately treated. The scarring will be permanent. Murphy leaned forward. Chemical burns. From what? She claimed it was lye, said she'd been making soap, experimenting with old recipes, and had an accident. But Sheriff, Dr. Marsh met his eyes with an intensity that bordered on desperation. The pattern of burns, the severity, the locations, they're not consistent with a soap-making accident. They're consistent with repeated, prolonged exposure to a powerful caustic substance, something like sodium hydroxide in high concentration. The words landed like hammer blows. Murphy's mind raced through the implications, connecting dots he'd been circling for months. Sodium hydroxide, caustic soda, the same substance used in industrial cleaning, in leather tanning, in bone dissolution, Murphy said aloud. Dr. Marsh nodded grimly. I've read about it in medical literature. There was a case in England in the 1890s, and another in California just 5 years ago. Concentrated sodium hydroxide, heated to high temperatures, can reduce organic tissue and bone to a sludge that can be disposed of relatively easily. It's chemistry, Sheriff. Horrible, calculated chemistry. The room seemed to shrink around Murphy. Everything he'd suspected, everything he'd feared, was crystallizing into undeniable truth. Did you confront her? I tried. Asked her directly what she'd really been doing with caustic chemicals. She became not agitated exactly, more resigned, tired. She looked at me with these exhausted eyes and said, "Sometimes survival requires terrible things, Doctor. Sometimes the only way to escape a cage is to dissolve the bars." He closed his notebook with shaking hands. That's when I knew. That's when I was certain. Why didn't she see another doctor? Why come to you at all if she knew you'd suspect? Because I'm the only doctor within 50 miles, and the burns were becoming infected. She had no choice, and I think— Dr. Marsh hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I think part of her wanted to be caught, wanted this to end. Murphy stood and walked to the window, looking out at Main Street where people were beginning their morning routines, oblivious to the horror being discussed 2 floors above their heads. He thought about Robert Hartley, about what remained of him now, about the laws he'd sworn to uphold, and the justice they supposedly served. What's your medical opinion, Doctor? Off the record. Off the record? Dr. Marsh stood as well, his joints creaking. My opinion is that Evelyn Hartley killed her husband in self-defense and then disposed of his body using chemical dissolution to avoid prosecution in a legal system that would have blamed her for her own abuse. My opinion is that she's guilty of murder and disposal of evidence, but morally, ethically, I don't know what she's guilty of anymore. I don't know where justice lies in a situation like this. But legally, she's committed multiple felonies. And legally, you have to act on this information. Murphy nodded slowly. The moment he'd been simultaneously pursuing and avoiding had finally arrived. There was no more ambiguity, no more room for doubt. Only choices, all of them terrible. I need you to document everything, he said. Every injury you treated over the years, the burns you observed yesterday, your medical assessment. Make it official. You're going to arrest her. I'm going to do my job. But Murphy's voice lacked conviction, and both men knew it. 2 hours later, Murphy and Deputy Frank Colson stood once again on the porch of the Hartley house. This time, they had a warrant, hastily obtained from Judge Harrison, based on Dr. Marsh's testimony and medical findings. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The door opened before Murphy could knock, as if Evelyn had been waiting. She wore a simple gray dress and those black gloves, her face composed, but not peaceful. She looked like a woman who'd already said her goodbyes to the world. "Sheriff," she said quietly. "I suppose Dr. Marsh called you." "Mrs. Hartley, I have a warrant to search these premises and to take you in for questioning regarding the disappearance of your husband." She stepped aside without argument. "The cellar. That's what you want to see, isn't it? The answer you've been looking for all these months." "Ma'am, you don't have to say anything. I know my rights, Sheriff, and I'm choosing to waive them." She gestured toward the back of the house. "This way." Murphy exchanged a glance with Frank, who looked as unnerved as Murphy felt. This wasn't how arrests usually proceeded. There should have been resistance, denial, the theatrical performance of innocence. But Evelyn moved through her home like a docent in a museum, calmly leading them to the evidence of her own crime. The cellar door was located off the kitchen, a heavy wooden thing with 3 deadbolts. Evelyn unlocked them one by one, the metallic clicks echoing in the silence. "I want you to understand something before you go down there," she said, her hand resting on the doorknob. "Robert wasn't just cruel occasionally. He wasn't just rough sometimes. He was systematically, deliberately, joyfully cruel. He broke me in pieces over 15 years, and every time I healed, he found new ways to break me again." Murphy found his voice. "Mrs. Hartley, anything you say can be used." "I know." "I don't care." She opened the door, revealing wooden stairs descending into darkness. On November 17th, Robert came home drunk, drunker than usual. He'd lost money at poker and decided I was to blame. For his losses, for his failures, for every disappointment in his miserable life. He came at me with his belt. Not the first time, but it was going to be the last time. She flipped a switch, and a single bulb illuminated the cellar below. Murphy could smell it immediately, that chemical odor people had reported, sharp and acrid even now, months later. "I hit him with a cast-iron skillet," Evelyn continued, her voice steady as she descended the stairs. Murphy and Frank followed, their feet heavy on the old wood. "Hit him 3 times before he stopped moving. I thought I'd killed him, but he was just unconscious, and I realized this was my chance, my only chance." The cellar was exactly what Murphy had imagined in his worst nightmares. A concrete floor with a drain in the center, metal drums lined against one wall, some empty, some sealed, a workbench covered with glass beakers, rubber tubing, temperature gauges, and in the corner, a large metal vat on a propane burner, the kind used for rendering. "I'd been planning for months," Evelyn said, running her gloved hand along the workbench, reading, learning, preparing. "I knew how much sodium hydroxide I'd need, what temperature to maintain, how long the process would take. I dragged Robert down here while he was still unconscious, before he could wake and hurt me again." "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered. "He woke up while I was restraining him," Evelyn continued, as if she hadn't heard. "Started screaming, threatening, promising what he'd do to me when he got free. So I—" She paused, and for the first time, emotion cracked her voice. "I didn't wait. I couldn't wait. I started the process while he was alive. The silence that followed was absolute. Murphy felt bile rising in his throat, felt the world tilting on its axis. This wasn't justice. This wasn't self-defense. This was something else entirely, something that existed in the gray spaces between victim and perpetrator, between survival and vengeance. "It took 3 days," Evelyn said. 3 days of maintaining temperature, of adding more hydroxide, of watching him dissolve. And then I disposed of what remained down that drain, bit by bit, over the course of weeks. His truck, I drove to that logging road myself, made it look like he'd abandoned it. The books I burned last month were his business records, anything that might complicate probate. She turned to face Murphy, her gray eyes dry and clear. "So there you have it, Sheriff. My confession. Everything you needed to know and probably wish you didn't." Murphy stood frozen, his notebook forgotten in his coat pocket. The law was clear. This was murder, premeditated and methodical. But every other part of him, the human part, the part that remembered hearing those Friday night screams and doing nothing, that part couldn't reconcile the word murder with the broken woman standing before him. "Mrs. Hartley," he said finally, "I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Robert James Hartley." "I know." Frank moved forward with handcuffs, but Evelyn held up her gloved hands. "May I remove these first? I'd prefer you see what this justice cost me." Murphy nodded, unable to speak. Evelyn peeled off the black leather gloves slowly, revealing hands that made Frank audibly gasp. The flesh was mottled with scars, the fingers slightly twisted from improper healing, the palms a roadmap of chemical destruction. These were the hands of someone who'd paid a terrible price for her freedom. "I don't regret it," she said, as Frank cuffed her wrists, gentle despite the circumstances. "I'd do it again. I'd do it 1,000 times. Because every night I sleep now, I sleep without fear. That's worth more than your prison, Sheriff. That's worth everything." The trial of Evelyn Margaret Hartley began on May 3, 1940, and became a sensation that drew reporters from as far as New York and Chicago. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded killer who'd methodically murdered her husband and destroyed the evidence. The defense argued self-defense, painting a portrait of years of abuse that left the jury visibly shaken. But the confession complicated everything: the premeditation, the calculated nature of the disposal, the fact that Robert had been alive when the process began. These facts couldn't be reconciled with traditional self-defense doctrines. The jury deliberated for 6 days. They found her guilty of voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, a compromise that satisfied no one but reflected the impossible moral calculus they'd been asked to perform. Evelyn was sentenced to 15 years in the West Virginia State Penitentiary for women. Sheriff Dalton Murphy attended the sentencing. As they led Evelyn from the courtroom, she caught his eye. She didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't offer any gesture of acknowledgement. But in that brief moment of connection, Murphy understood something profound. She'd already served her sentence, paid her dues in ways the law could never measure. She'd dissolved her husband in acid, yes. But the acid had dissolved parts of her too. The parts that still believed in justice, in protection, in the basic social contract that said suffering would be witnessed and stopped. In the end, Murphy thought, everyone in Harlow Falls was guilty. Guilty of hearing and ignoring. Guilty of knowing and looking away. Guilty of letting a woman be tortured in plain sight while they maintained their comfortable silence. The case file closed in August 1940. Evelyn served 8 years before being released on parole in 1948. She moved to California, changed her name, and disappeared into the anonymity of a different life. The house on Willow Creek Road stood empty for 3 years before being torn down. Some said the smell never fully left, that the ground itself had been poisoned by what happened in that cellar. But the truth was simpler and more haunting. The real poison wasn't in the ground. It was in the silence that had allowed a monster to thrive, and in the terrible mathematics that forced a victim to become something monstrous herself, just to survive. Years later, when Sheriff Murphy was asked about the Hartley case, he would always pause before answering. Then he'd say, "Sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing. And sometimes, when we look at evil closely enough, we find it looking back at us from our own reflections." The case remained officially closed. But for those who lived through it, who heard the confessions and saw the evidence, who understood the full horror and tragedy of those cold months in 1940, nothing was ever truly resolved. Some questions don't have answers. Some stories don't have endings. They just have silence and memory and the heavy weight of knowing what humans are capable of when pushed beyond the boundaries of endurance. The end.